I didn't go there to scream or throw punches, I went there to look into the eyes of the man who dismantled my life and ask him one question: why? Most people expect rage, but what we found was something far more chilling. Sit with us as we dissect the cold, hollow justifications of a predator who saw a marriage and chose to break it anyway. My name is Jonathan. I'm 41, I work as a structural engineer for a firm in Richmond, and for 13 years I've been married to a woman I trusted completely, the kind of complete trust that, I've come to understand, can become its own quiet blind spot if you never once stop to examine it. The coffee shop was on Gray Street, chosen deliberately because it was 2 miles from the hospital where Michelle worked and far enough from anywhere Preston Cole would expect to run into anyone who knew him socially. I arrived 15 minutes early and sat facing the door, the way you'd position yourself for a job interview you already knew the outcome of. When he walked in, 45, gray at the temples, the kind of unbothered confidence that comes from 12 years running a hospital's finance department, he didn't recognize me at first. I'd met him exactly twice, both times at hospital holiday parties, both times as Michelle's husband, a category of person easy to forget once the party's over. "Jonathan, right?" he said, sliding into the chair across from me, still smiling, still entirely unaware that this wasn't the casual coffee his own text messages, the ones I'd been reading for 6 weeks by then, made this meeting out to be. "Michelle mentioned you wanted to talk about the retirement account restructuring. Happy to walk through it." I let him say that whole sentence before I answered. I wanted him fully seated, fully comfortable, before I took that comfort away. "I know about you and my wife," I said. "Every detail. Every hotel in Norfolk, every conference you both happened to attend, the December bonus you moved from her direct reports to keep HR from asking questions about favoritism. I'm not here about a retirement account. I'm here because I wanted to see your face when you understood that I already know everything, and that this conversation has already been happening for 6 weeks without you." I watched something behind his eyes recalculate in real time, the specific, visible moment a man realizes the ground he thought was solid was never his to stand on. That conversation is where this story ends. But to understand how I got there, calm, prepared, already 3 steps ahead of a man who thought he was still hidden, you need to go back 5 months, to a version of my marriage I still believed, completely, was exactly what it looked like from the outside. 5 months before that coffee shop, none of this would have registered as anything but the unremarkable texture of a marriage in its comfortable middle years, which, I understand now, is exactly what made it so easy to miss. Michelle and I met in graduate school, married at 28, and built a life that looked, by any reasonable measure, solid, a house in the West End, 2 kids who mostly got along, careers that let us live comfortably without either of us resenting the other's hours. She'd worked her way up through hospital administration over a decade, and 18 months earlier had landed under Preston Cole's direct supervision when the finance department reorganized, a promotion she'd been thrilled about at the time, one I remember celebrating with her over a bottle of wine we couldn't really afford. I trusted Michelle completely, and I want to be honest that this wasn't a passive thing, it was closer to a policy I'd built deliberately, somewhere early in our marriage, after watching my own parents' relationship curdle under years of mutual suspicion. I decided trust would be the foundation of what I built instead, and for over a decade that decision had served us well. What I hadn't accounted for was how easily complete trust can shade into simply not paying attention, how the absence of suspicion can also become the absence of the ordinary curiosity a marriage needs to stay honest. The first thing I noticed, without registering it as anything worth noticing, was that Michelle's work trips had grown slightly more frequent that autumn. A finance conference in Norfolk, a regional summit in Charlottesville, always described the same practical way, always framed around Preston needing her specifically for the department's presentation. I remember feeling, if anything, a kind of pride that her expertise had become that indispensable. She started keeping her laptop closed when I walked into the room, a small habit shift I noticed the way you notice a picture frame hanging slightly crooked, present, faintly odd, forgotten within the hour. She'd laugh more on calls with colleagues those months, a lighter sound I hadn't heard as consistently in years, and I remember being genuinely glad of it, the way you're glad to see someone you love re-energized by their work. There's a particular kind of quiet that settles into a marriage once both people have stopped asking each other real questions and started calling the silence stability instead. Maybe you know that kind of quiet. It doesn't feel like a problem while you're inside it. It just slowly replaces curiosity with routine, and by the time routine is the only language left, you've usually stopped noticing the substitution ever happened. I want to be honest about my own part in this, because it would be easy to tell this only as something that happened to me. I'd stopped asking Michelle real questions about her days sometime around Noah's first year of school. I asked about logistics, whether her presentation had gone well, whether Preston had liked the numbers. I stopped asking what any of it actually felt like to live inside. I told myself that was respect for her competence. I understand now it was also, quietly, an absence I'd let grow without noticing its shape. The first real crack came on a Thursday in early autumn, when Michelle mentioned, almost in passing, that Preston had personally requested she join him for the Norfolk conference again that November, the third time that year, and something in the specific way she said his name, a fraction warmer than she said any other colleagues, caught my attention just long enough to register before I let it pass. I asked, lightly, whether anyone else from the department was going. She said yes, listed 2 names, both plausible. I let it go. I told myself conferences always run the same small circle of people. I didn't think about it again until 11 days later, when Ava mentioned that Mommy's work phone had been buzzing all through dinner the night before, a detail I filed away and then, once again, let pass, the beginning of a pattern I wouldn't fully see until much later, when it was too late to have caught it early. By October, I'd started keeping a private, half-acknowledged log I didn't admit to myself I was keeping, dates, described work events, small inconsistencies that meant nothing individually and something I wasn't ready to name collectively. Noah, 7, asked at breakfast one Saturday why Mommy's boss had called the house phone the previous evening instead of her cell, a detail so specific and so easy to explain away that I almost didn't register what it implied. I asked Michelle about it that evening. She said her cell battery had died and Preston needed to reach her about a budget deadline. It was, on its own, an entirely reasonable answer. I filed it anyway, next to the warmth in her voice, next to the buzzing phone at dinner. I traveled for a 3-day site inspection in Norfolk myself in mid-October, an odd coincidence I remember finding almost amusing at the time, and on the second night, checking in with Michelle by phone, I heard, faintly, in the background of her call, what sounded unmistakably like a hotel bar, glasses and low conversation, though she'd told me she was working late at her own desk downtown. I didn't say anything. I told myself hotel bars and downtown offices could sound alike over a bad connection. I want to stop here for a second. If you've ever heard a small, wrong detail bleeding through the edges of a phone call and talked yourself out of what your own ears were telling you, you already know the specific, quiet unease that follows you the rest of that night. It isn't proof yet. It's smaller and colder than that, a single loose thread you decide, deliberately, not to pull. I let it go that night, the way I'd let the others go, and told myself I was becoming the kind of husband who invents suspicion out of nothing. That embarrassment shut the thought down for almost 2 more weeks. She told me, much later, what that particular week had actually been. I told myself, standing in that hotel bar in Norfolk, that this was the last time it would go this far, that I'd let it be one conference, one lapse, and then rebuild the wall I'd let come down. I remember checking my phone between texting you goodnight and going back to sit with him, and feeling something in me tear cleanly down the middle. I wanted to be exactly where I was standing. I also wanted, badly, to call you and end the whole thing before it went any further. I did neither. I finished the drink and went back to the table. That's what she told me. I knew none of it yet. I only had a bad phone connection and a small, dismissed unease I still hadn't let myself name. The subplot that mattered more than I understood came through my colleague Danny, who mentioned, almost in passing at our own office in late October, that his wife, a nurse at the same hospital, had noticed Preston and Michelle always seemed to end up on the same projects lately, said with the kind of unbothered curiosity of someone who'd noticed a pattern without yet attaching any weight to it. I thanked Danny for the observation and changed the subject, but the sentence sat with me for days in a way I couldn't fully explain to myself. I found the first piece of real evidence 3 weeks later, entirely by accident, a hotel loyalty program email, addressed to Michelle, open on the shared family tablet she sometimes forgot to log out of, confirming a 2-night stay in Norfolk for a weekend she told me was a solo work retreat with no overnight component at all. I stood in the kitchen holding that tablet for a long time. I told myself there might be an innocent explanation, a schedule change, a miscommunication I'd simply misunderstood. I didn't ask her about it directly. I put the tablet down and said nothing, a decision I've turned over many times since, uncertain whether it was patience or the same old conflict avoidance dressed in a calmer voice. I didn't confront Michelle over that hotel email. That decision, more than any single piece of evidence, is the part of this I understand most clearly now. Looking back, I made a choice, sometime in early November, to become a man who gathers quietly rather than a man who reacts, and I've never fully settled whether that was wisdom or simply another form of the same avoidance that had let this go unquestioned for months. I started methodically, the way I'd approach a structural assessment, building a case from documented, verifiable pieces rather than suspicion alone. I requested, through a colleague with access to the hospital's HR system who owed me a favor and asked no questions, quiet confirmation of the department's actual conference attendance records for the past year. Michelle had attended 4 out-of-town events with Preston specifically, 3 more than she'd ever described to me, 2 of which included overnight stays she'd characterized as day trips. Danny's earlier comment resurfaced with new weight once I had that document in hand. His wife's offhand observation about the 2 of them always ending up on the same projects now read less like coincidence and more like a pattern deliberately engineered by someone with the authority to assign it. I found, in the second week of November, a credit card statement, one I still had shared online access to, something Michelle had simply never thought to close off, another quiet consequence of 13 years of the same complete trust I'd built our marriage on, showing a hotel charge in Charlottesville, dated 2 weeks earlier, on a night she told me she was staying with her sister after a late meeting ran long. Her sister, when I called under an unrelated pretext, confirmed she hadn't seen Michelle in over a month. By the 3rd week of November, I had what I needed, a documented pattern spanning at least 8 months, for falsified trip descriptions, one independently corroborated account from Danny's wife, and a direct contradiction from Michelle's own sister. I didn't feel triumphant assembling it. I felt something closer to grief arriving early, grief for a version of my marriage I now understood had stopped being real sometime the previous spring, while I was still calling it stable out of nothing but habit. I want to stop here for a moment, because this is harder to say plainly than the betrayal itself. I could have confronted Michelle the day I found that hotel loyalty email on the tablet. I chose instead to keep building the case in silence for nearly a month, and I've asked myself since whether that was discipline or simply the same conflict avoidance that had let 8 months of small inconsistencies go unquestioned in the first place. I think it was some of both. I wanted the entire, undeniable shape of it in my hands before I let her see that I knew any of it, not to punish her with the waiting, but because I needed, for my own sake, to stop being the last person in my own marriage who didn't understand what was actually happening inside it. I told no one what I'd found, not Danny, not my own brother, until every document was printed, dated, and organized clearly enough that there would be no room left for the kind of soft, partial explanation I suspected, correctly, Michelle was fully capable of constructing under pressure. I chose a Sunday evening, deliberately, when the kids were at a sleepover and the house was fully, uninterruptedly quiet. I laid everything on the kitchen table before Michelle came in from the garage, the conference attendance record, the credit card statement, a simple typed timeline cross-referencing each date against what she'd actually told me at the time. She stopped in the doorway when she saw the papers, and I watched something in her posture go very still, the particular stillness of someone who has spent months half expecting this exact evening and finding, now that it had arrived, that no rehearsal had prepared her for its actual weight. "Sit down," I said. My voice didn't shake. I'd had a month to make sure of that. "I want you to look at this. Then I want the truth, not a version built to survive tonight." She sat, and looked at the papers for a long moment, and I watched her search, visibly, for an angle that could hold against dates this specific. It's not what all of this makes it look like, she said, which is, I've come to understand, almost always the first sentence spoken by someone who already knows precisely how bad it actually is. Some of those trips were real work. You're reading intent into things that were mostly innocent. Your sister told me you haven't seen her in over a month, I said, quiet, laying my finger on the Charlottesville line rather than raising my voice. Danny's wife noticed the pattern before I did. For conferences you told me were solo, all with Preston specifically assigned. I'm not asking you to poke holes in what I have. I'm asking you to actually tell me, because right now you're still trying to make this smaller than it is, and I've had a month of watching exactly how large it actually is. She tried, for a while longer, to hold the frame, reframing specific trips as work necessity, questioning whether I was misreading ordinary professional proximity as something it wasn't. Each time she shifted the explanation, I set another document on the table between us, until there was no version of innocent left standing that the paper trail could support. Since March, she said finally, flatly, the composure simply running out of road. It started at the March conference. I'm not going to keep making the timeline smaller, because you clearly already have all of it. I let the number sit in the room. I need to hear the rest, I said. Not the summary. What actually happened, and why? She was quiet for a long moment, and then, watching the table rather than my face, she began, no longer performing calm, just tired in a way that read, finally, as genuine. It started at that first Norfolk conference in March. Preston asked my opinion on a restructuring proposal in front of the entire regional board, and defended it when two directors pushed back, and afterward told me, privately, that I was the sharpest financial mind in that building and it was criminal I'd been passed over for the department director role twice. Nobody had said anything like that to me in years, not you, not anyone at the hospital. I went back to my room that night and cried, actually cried, because I hadn't realized how much I'd needed someone to say I was good at something beyond being efficient at logistics. I told myself it was one dinner, one conversation, completely harmless. Then there was a second conference, and a third, and each time I told myself this was the last one, that I'd go back to being exactly who I was supposed to be once it was over. I believed that less and less each time and kept saying it anyway, because admitting I didn't believe it meant admitting what I'd let myself become. I was terrified constantly, not just of exactly this evening, though obviously that most of all, but of what it meant that I could sit in a room with him discussing a hospital budget and then come home and help Ava with fractions like nothing in me had shifted at all. I started avoiding the hallway photos some mornings, the ones from our wedding, because I couldn't look at them and hold both versions of myself in my head at once. There was a night in September, I almost stopped it myself. He mentioned, casually, something about eventually figuring things out long-term, like we were building towards some actual future together, and it frightened me so badly I avoided him for nearly 2 weeks. Then the November conference came around and he was assigned to lead it and I let it start again, because 2 weeks of feeling like a person who mattered again was apparently harder to give up than 2 weeks of shame was to sit with. I don't know how to make any of this sound like less than exactly what it is. I let a man tell me I was talented in a way my own marriage had stopped telling me, and I mistook that for something worth risking everything over. I know now it wasn't. I don't think I fully understood that until I was sitting across from you tonight with every date already laid out. I asked her, near the end, whether she loved him. She said no, and then, more honestly, that she wasn't sure what to call the specific hunger of being professionally and personally seen again after years of feeling reduced to logistics, whether that counted as love or simply its borrowed shape. I believe that answer more than nearly anything else she told me that night. I need you out of this house by the end of the week, I said. I'll handle the kids' schedule until then. This isn't a conversation we're going to keep having. She didn't argue. I think some part of her had been braced for exactly that sentence for months. Michelle moved into a rental across town 9 days later. The divorce process began in December, and I want to be honest that I approached it the same way I'd approached gathering the evidence, methodically, without theatrics, taking what a fair settlement entitled me to and no more, though no more, still meant retaining the house and the greater share of our joint accounts once the timeline of her spending on those undisclosed trips became part of the record. Preston Cole's own reckoning arrived through channels entirely outside my control. The hospital's HR department, once an anonymous complaint referencing a documented pattern of favoritism and travel irregularities, reached them, a complaint I neither filed nor discouraged, though I won't pretend I was sorry to hear it existed, opened a formal review that ended, within 2 months, with his quiet resignation ahead of a termination that seemed, by every account that reached me, already decided. He left Richmond entirely by spring. I never heard what became of him after that, and I found, somewhat to my own surprise, that I didn't especially need to. Which brings us back to that coffee shop on Gray Street, 5 months after the tablet, 3 weeks before he resigned, in the narrow window when I still knew things about his situation that he didn't yet know I knew. I'd arranged the meeting through Michelle's old calendar access, still technically shared, under the pretense of the retirement account question. I sat across from him and watched, in real time, the specific unraveling of a man who'd spent 8 months believing himself entirely undiscovered. Why? I asked him, once he'd stopped trying to talk his way backward out of the conversation. Not an excuse. An actual answer. You knew she was married. You knew she had 2 kids. Why choose that specifically, when there was nothing stopping you from choosing literally anyone else? He was quiet for a long moment, and when he answered, there was no real remorse in it, only a kind of hollow, practiced rationalization I suspect he'd built to survive his own conscience rather than to actually explain himself to me. It wasn't calculated the way you're making it sound. She was talented and underappreciated, and I noticed her. What happened after that just happened. It didn't just happen, I said. You assigned her to 4 conferences specifically. You moved a bonus to avoid HR questions. That's not something that just happens to a person. That's a decision, made repeatedly, by someone who understood exactly what he was doing and decided the cost was acceptable as long as it wasn't his own. He didn't have an answer to that. I watched him try to construct one and fail, and understood, finally, that I'd gotten what I actually came for, not an apology, which I hadn't expected and didn't particularly need, but the simple, undeniable confirmation that there had never been a version of this where he saw Michelle, or our marriage, or our kids, as anything more than an acceptable cost of his own convenience. I left that coffee shop and didn't look back, in every sense the phrase can carry. I didn't need to see him again. I didn't need to know what became of him beyond the resignation. Whatever satisfaction I'd imagined that meeting might give me, the actual thing turned out smaller and quieter than I'd expected. Not triumph, just the plain, useful confirmation that I'd correctly understood exactly what kind of man I'd been dealing with. I could have stayed angry through that whole winter. I chose, somewhere in early spring, not to. That was the only kind of winning that ever actually mattered to me. I started sleeping through the night again sometime in April, and I noticed it specifically, not gradually, but as an actual morning where I woke and realized the low, constant static I'd carried since that first hotel email on the tablet simply wasn't there anymore. I hadn't announced it to anyone. I just noticed, one ordinary Tuesday, that the weight was gone. I'm not the same man who sat in that kitchen a year ago, complete trust as my whole operating philosophy, never once thinking to ask a real question underneath the logistics. I ask more now, of Ava and Noah about their actual days, of the few new people in my life, of myself. Trust, I've learned, isn't the same thing as never looking. It's choosing to look, honestly, and staying anyway when what you find is still worth staying for. The most striking contradiction in this story is that Jonathan built his entire marriage on a policy of complete trust meant to protect it from the corrosive suspicion he'd watched ruin his parents' relationship, and that same policy became the exact blind spot that let 8 months of deception pass unquestioned. Trust and attention are not the same thing, and this story turns on that distinction. Jonathan didn't fail by trusting Michelle. He failed by mistaking the absence of suspicion for the presence of real curiosity about her inner life. Preston's answer at the coffee shop is worth sitting with longer than the confrontation itself allows in the moment. "It just happened," is the kind of sentence that lets a person avoid ever fully reckoning with their own agency, and Jonathan's insistence on naming the specific, deliberate decisions behind that sentence, the reassigned conferences, the redirected bonus, reveals something important about how these situations actually function. They are rarely accidents that overtake people. They are chains of small, chosen actions that the people involved later prefer to describe as inevitable. Michelle's monologue about being told she was the sharpest financial mind in the building identifies the actual mechanism with unusual clarity, not romantic love, but a specific hunger to be professionally and personally seen after years of feeling reduced to household logistics. That hunger doesn't excuse what she did with it. It does explain why the first small permission felt survivable, and why each subsequent one did too, until the cumulative weight of the deception had grown too large to acknowledge honestly. The true turning point in this marriage likely wasn't the March conference at all, it was the moment, over a decade earlier, when Jonathan decided complete trust would replace the harder, more ongoing work of actually staying curious about his wife's inner life. That decision worked, quietly, for years. It only became a liability once there was something specific it needed to catch.